Hello dear students, this is me Dr. Alam, your instructor, and the subject is dynamic macroeconomics. This is our lecture number 10, where we will discuss understanding a macroeconomic model. As in the previous lecture, we have discussed the difference between dynamic and static model and its relationship with the macroeconomics. Outline of this lecture is start from introduction, where we will explain the role of the model in the macroeconomics. Then in the middle part of the lecture, we will explain aggregate supply curve, and in the later part, we will explain aggregate demand curve. So there are three subsections of this particular lecture: introduction, aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand curve. Understanding a macroeconomic model. We first need to understand how average prices of all goods and services produced in an economy affects the total quantity of output, the total amount of spent on goods and services in that economy. So this is the supply side, and this is the demand side. So on the supply side, we will explain here in this particular slide the aggregate supply curve. Normally, in the case of microeconomics, firms make decisions about what quantity supply based on the profits they expect to earn. To earn what? To earn to profit. In turn, they are also determined by the price of the output the firm sells and by the price of input. So the difference between price of input and price of output will be equal to profit. In the case of the price of input, what we mean by the input, that includes labor, raw material. Some firms need to buy or hire. So aggregate supply, that is denoted by AS or determined by AS, means that the quantity or the total quantity of output, in other words, the real GDP, firms will produce and sell. So the total amount of goods and services that is produced in an economy. So here we are measuring the aggregate supply in the form of real GDP. So the aggregate supply curve shows the total quantity of output relative to GDP the firms will produce and sell at each price level. This is the graph. Graph below shows aggregate supply curve. This is your supply curve. Here are the elements of the diagram: horizontal and vertical axis. This is your vertical axis. This is your horizontal axis. This is your aggregate supply curve. Many of the potential GDP on vertical line. So horizontal axis, this is measuring the real GDP. That is in billion of constant dollar in this use-based economy book. So this is the level of GDP adjusted for inflation. While on vertical axis, the average price level. Of all goods and services produced in economy and index number. So in macroeconomics, normally we talked about average prices. So on the graph, as the prices level rises, the aggregate supply rises. If you look at when the price, let's suppose 85 unit of price, the amount of quantity produced is 8,000. But when the price is increased, suppose from 85 to 105, the aggregate supply or the quantity of goods and services produced will be increased from 8,000 to somehow 9,500. So on the graph, as the price level rises, the aggregate supply, quantity of goods and services supply rises as well. The price level shown on the vertical axis represents the price for final goods and services or output bought in the economy, not the price level for intermediate goods and services that are input for production. So here in this particular point, we are explaining that when we talked about the prices of goods and services, by price of goods and services we mean the price of final goods and services, not the price of level of intermediate goods, which is already included in the value of the prices of final goods and services. As aggregate supply describes how suppliers will react to a high price level for final output of goods and services, while price of input like labor and energy remains constant. So if a firm across the economy face a situation where price level of what they produce and sell is rising, but their cost of production are not rising, then the appeal of high profits will induce them to extend the production. Here, they are explaining that when the prices of goods and services rises, the supply will be rise. If you look at the supply curve shape, the slope of the aggregate supply changes from nearly flat at its far left to nearly vertical at its far right. If you look at this portion, this is somehow the supply curve is flat, but in this part the supply curve is almost nearly vertical. As for left of the aggregate supply, level of output in the economy is far below potential GDP. The quantity that an economy can produce by fully employing at existing level of labor, physical capital, and technology in the context of its existing market and legal institution. At the relatively low level of output, level of unemployment are high, and many factories are running only part-time or have closed their doors. In this situation, a relatively small increase in prices of the output that business sell with no rise in input prices can encourage a considerable surge in the quantity of aggregate supply. Real GDP, because so many factories are ready to swing into production. As the quantity produced increases, as the quantity produced increases, however, certain firms and industry will start running into limit. For example, nearly all of the expert workers in certain industry could have jobs or factories in certain geographical area, or industries might be running at full speed. In intermediate area of aggregate supply curve, a high price level for output continue to encourage a greater quantity of output, but as the increasing steep upward slope of the aggregate supply curve shows increase in quantity response to a given rise in price level. Yes, look at this part. When there is an increase in prices, ultimately there will be an increase in quantity supply, but will not quite as large as in this part. At the far right, the aggregate curve becomes nearly vertical. At this quantity, high prices per output cannot encourage additional output, because even if the firm wants to expand output, the input of labor and machinery in the economy are fully employed. Natural real output, not to maximum possible output, always going to some inefficient efficiencies in the economy. People switching jobs, can't work day and night. So in this particular case, there is only increase in prices, because when all the resources are fully utilized and the labor are not in a position to do work day and night. In our example, aggregate supply vertical line in the exhibit show that potential GDP occur at total output of 9,500 when the economy is operating at its potential GDP. Machines and factories are running at its capacity, and the unemployment rate is relatively low at the natural rate of unemployment. For this reason, potential GDP is sometimes also called full employment GDP. Why does aggregate supply cross potential the GDP? This part. The aggregate supply curve is typically drawn to cross the potential GDP line. This shape may seem puzzling. How can an economy produce at an output level which is higher than its potential or fully employment GDP? Economic intuition here is, if the price for output were higher, enough producers would make obsessive efforts to produce. All workers would be on double overtime. All machines would run in 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Such hyper-intense production would go beyond using potential labor and physical capital resources fully to use them in a way that is not sustainable in the long term. Thus, it is indeed possible for production to run above potential GDP, but only in the short run. In this particular case, then it is called overheating economy. But this will be possible only for short time period, short term. The third part of our this lecture is about aggregate demand curve. By aggregate demand curve, that is denoted by AD, the amount of total spending on domestic goods and services in economy. Aggregate demand includes all four components of demand. What are those four components? Consumption, investment, government spending, net export, export minus export. This is the shape of the aggregate demand curve. This demand is determined by a number of factors. One of them is price level. A aggregate demand curve shows total spending on domestic goods and services at each price level. Just like aggregate supply curve, horizontal axis shows the real GDP and vertical axis shows the average price level. But a big difference in shape of aggregate demand at slope downward. Why price level increase lead to a lower spending? We need to understand how changes in price level affect different components of aggregate demand. As we know that aggregate demand is equal to consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net export. The wealth effect holds that if the price level increases, the buying power of saving that people have stored up in bank accounts and other assets will diminish, eaten away to some extent by inflation. Because a rise in price level reduces people wealth, consumption spending will fall as the price level rises. So here one effect is the wealth effect, which means that when there is increase in price level, your saving will be disturbed. Even your other assets will be diminished. Your spending will be more. You will be spend more amount of money on the same goods and services that will lead to reduce people's wealth. Consumption spending will fall as the price level rises. The interest rate effect explains that as price of output rises, the same purchase will take more money or credit to accomplish. This additional demand for money and credit will push interest rate high. In turn, high interest rate will reduce borrowing by business for investment purposes and reduce borrowing by household for home and cars, thus reducing both consumption and investment. It means that due to increase in prices, interest rate will be high. When interest rate will high, that will decrease your consumption, will decrease your investment, and these two are the sub part of your aggregate demand. The full price effect point out that if prices rises in the US while remaining fixed in other countries, then goods in the US will be relatively more expensive compared to goods in the rest of the world. Here they are talked about the open economy. So US exports will be relatively more expensive, thus the quantity of exports sold will fall. Imports from abroad will be relatively cheaper, so the quantity of imports will rise, thus a higher domestic price level relative to price level in other countries will reduce net export. The net export is equal to export minus import. So when there is increase in prices, your export will be more expensive, your imports will be relatively cheaper, imports will be higher, export will be reduced, so the net export will decrease. And this is also one of the component of the aggregate demand, which is equal to C plus I plus G plus N minus X. x minus m. For this reason, the aggregate demand curve in our example, aggregate demand curve was sloped downward fairly steeply. The steep slope indicates that a high price level for final output does reduce aggregate demand for all the three reasons, but the change in the quantity of aggregate demand as a result of a change in price level is not very large. This was all about the understanding macroeconomic model, aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand curve. For more details, you can follow the book Blanchard Stanley Fischer Lecture of Macroeconomics, MIT Press, 1989. Thank you so much.